Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ros-Lehtinen.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, just a few days ago, the White House formally transmitted to Congress the Iranian nuclear agreement, and I'm holding it here in my hand. And now there will be much discussion in Congress over the role of this legislative body regarding nuclear agreements, but I would like to remind my colleagues that a process is already in place for civil nuclear agreements. And this Iran deal that we have in front of us includes sections about a civil nuclear cooperation with Iran. Under current law, Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act specifies the conditions by which the United States should enter into a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with other countries. Parts of the terms determined by the 123 agreements is the cessation from enrichment or reprocessing, a term that is coined, Mr. Speaker, as the gold standard. But the Obama administration has taken the liberty to enter into 123 agreements without abiding by the gold standard. But why should we hold different countries accountable for different terms when it comes to proliferation? We should be holding each country to the very strictest of standards to ensure maximum safeguards are in place. This is why in the last Congress, I reintroduced, alongside with my congressional colleague Brad Sherman, a bill which reforms the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 to provide greater congressional oversight of nuclear with foreign countries and to protect against the threat of nuclear proliferation. So when the President says that it's either this deal or we go to war, there's actually another option. Let's not forget about the U.S.-Russia nuclear cooperation agreement, which was previously withdrawn by the Bush administration in 2008 because the President could not certify under the Iran-North Korea-Syria Non-Proliferation Act that Russia was not providing nuclear, missile, and advanced conventional weapons to Iran. Yet, though this new deal with Iran, through this new deal, Iran can buy nuclear, missile, and advanced conventional weapons from the Russians. Next on the list was the 123 agreement with Vietnam. I strongly oppose this agreement because it allowed Vietnam to enrich. Next up, the pending U.S.-China nuclear cooperation agreement. Again, I oppose that agreement because it allows China to enrich. So what kind of message are we sending to our allies, Mr. Speaker? Jordan and the UAE, some of our closest partners in the region, are not allowed to enrich based on their commitments to our 123 agreements, but bad actors such as Russia, China, and Vietnam, oh, they can enrich. It does not make much sense, Mr. Speaker. Page 5, Section 13, and I hope that our constituents read it, of the general provisions of the Iran nuclear agreement states that P5+1 nations will, quote, cooperate as appropriate in the field of peaceful uses of nuclear energy and engage in mutually determined civil nuclear cooperation projects as detailed in Annex 3. So when we go to Annex 3, the situation becomes really scary. According to Annex 3, the P5+1 nations and Iran can cooperate on civil, nuclear, and scientific projects. What does that mean? Oh, it spells it out, and it includes, listen to this, facilitation of Iran's acquisition of light water research and power reactors for research, development, and testing, construction of new light water power reactors, including small and medium-sized nuclear reactors, construction of state-of-the-art light water moderated multi-purpose research reactors, supply of state-of-the-art instrumentation and control systems for the research and power reactors. Oh, but the list keeps going. Supply of nuclear simulation and software solutions with regard to these research and power reactors. On-the-job training on fuel management and scenarios for these research and power nuclear reactors. And last but not least, joint technical review of Iran's current nuclear reactors upon the request by Iran in order to upgrade current equipment and systems. So essentially, we will be helping Iran to modernize and upgrade their reactors. This is absolutely absurd and dangerously absurd, Mr. Speaker. How could we ever expect any country to agree to the gold standard when they can point to the JCPOA and say they want the Iran standard? They don't want the gold standard. We want the Iran standard, because that is what is going to be one of the lasting legacies of this weak and dangerous deal. We have obliterated any of our moral or legal standing to insist that other countries forego their own enrichment programs. No country leaders in their right minds would ever agree to anything less than what we have allowed Iran to do. And now, if we don't block this deal's implementation, Mr. Speaker, we are putting into motion a nuclear arms race that we will not be able to stop. Mr. Speaker, one of the most egregious mistakes of this nuclear deal, which is saying something, it's a long list of bad things. This deal is chock full of egregious mistakes. But one of the worst is the lifting of UN sanctions on conventional weapons and ballistic missiles, as well as the lifting of sanctions on Iran's central figures of its nuclear weapons program by the EU and the UN. Just last night, Mr. Speaker, the Wall Street Journal reported on the sanctions that are to be lifted on the Iranians and the institutions behind Iran's decades-long covert and illegal nuclear program. This doesn't even begin to touch on the issues of sanctions being lifted against Iran's Quds Force leaders and the IRGC, the very same people who are responsible for carrying out and planning Iran's most deadly attacks and for supporting terror attacks across the world. The very same individuals, Mr. Speaker, who have American service members' blood on their hands. That's right, the administration and the P5+1 have agreed right there in Annex 1 and Annex 2 to remove these individuals and these entities from the UN and European sanctions list. How the administration can even begin to try to justify removing these people from these sanctions lists and these designations is beyond comprehension. In fact, it is a direct affront to a woman who has served in the U.S. Armed Forces and their friends, families, and loved ones. The administration needs to explain, and I would like the viewers to look at this poster, how Soleimani, the gentleman here in the middle, head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, the commander of the Quds Force, not only gets to get rid of these sanctions, but soon will get a boon to his coffers to increase his attacks against the U.S. and our interests. But look at this rogues gallery. We're not done yet. How about General Vahidi? General Vahidi, this fine gentleman here, former Quds Force commander, Iranian defense minister, who has been wanted by Interpol since 2007 for his role in the 1994 AMIA Jewish Center bombing in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He will come off some of these sanctions lists. This gentleman responsible for the murder of innocent men, women, and children. But as the Wall Street Journal article notes, we're actually going to be lifting the sanctions on the scientists and the individuals responsible for developing Iran's covert nuclear weapons program. This will leave these individuals free to continue to work on the regime's nuclear program. But not only that, it will leave them free to proliferate their expertise and knowledge. What we have here, Mr. Speaker, is that we essentially have agreed to lift the sanctions and designations on most of the key individuals on Iran's covert nuclear weapons program, while at the same time allowing all of Iran's key components of its nuclear program to remain intact. How does that benefit our national security? We have agreed to lift sanctions on the Iranian equivalent of AQ Khan. This gentleman here, the head of Iran's WMD program. The A.Q. Khan, if you remember, Mr. Speaker, is the Pakistani nuclear physicist responsible for the proliferation network that helped Libya, North Korea, Iran, and China develop their nuclear programs. He is the equivalent of A.Q. Khan. The Iranian A.Q. Khan helped the regime in its attempt to develop a nuclear explosive device, which the regime still refuses to come clean about to the International Atomic Energy Agency. So look at this rogues gallery. We're not done. Yet now the Iranian equivalent of A.Q. Khan will be likely taken off the designation list before the terms of this agreement is up, meaning that by the time this deal expires, this Iranian A.Q. Khan will have had years to perfect his explosive device without repercussions. This deal will also lift sanctions on a nuclear scientist named Abbasi Davani. This fine gentleman here, head of Iran's Atomic Energy Agency. Not only was this man once the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, but he was sanctioned by the UN Security Council, sanctioned by the UN for his work on both Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program, which, by the way, just underscores the absurdity of the notion that Iran's nuclear program is for peaceful purposes. Only nations that intend on having a nuclear payload develop ballistic missiles. And this man was involved in both. Yet he, too, will be removed from the UN sanctions before this agreement expires, leaving him several years to continue his work without any international scrutiny. But we have one more fine gentleman to point out, Mr. Speaker. As if that wasn't enough, German engineer Gerhard Wieser, right over here, collaborating German scientist. He was an individual who was convicted and imprisoned in South Africa for his involvement in the A.Q. Khan network, and who has facilitated the sale of nuclear equipment to North Korea, to Iran, and to Libya. He will be delisted as well. And on top of all of this, Iran's organization involved in spearheading its nuclear weapons research will be removed from the U.S. sanctions list, despite its long record of noncompliance with the International Atomic Energy Agency. All I see in this agreement, Mr. Speaker, is a path to the Iranian bomb, and not the prevention of one, as the administration claimed was the objective. Any way you slice it, Mr. Speaker, Iran will be a nuclear weapon state within a decade or so, and these individuals will be free to harm our international interest. Even if the UN Security Council opts to reimpose sanctions on the regime, Iran has built into the agreement that this would be a violation of the agreement. Listen to that, Mr. Speaker. If the UN Security Council opts to reimpose sanctions, Iran has in this deal a stipulation that this would be a violation of the agreement, and then it can simply snap back its own nuclear program. That's the only snapback of Iran snapping back its own nuclear program. And now it will be free of all the burdens of sanctions. It will have its entire infrastructure complete with the added benefit of U.S. assistance in modernizing its equipment, in advancing certain aspects of it, as well as the key individuals involved and responsible for advancing the program, ready and able to produce a nuclear weapon without any problems whatsoever. Mr. Speaker, if Congress approves this deal, we are guaranteeing that Iran becomes a nuclear weapon state, and we are giving away every bit of leverage that we have against this rogue regime. This deal isn't going to avert a war. It might very well precipitate one. Our only real option for peace and a nuclear-free Middle East is to insist on a better deal. And we must back that up with tougher sanctions, not a promise to lift sanctions on some of the world's most dangerous individuals. How can we say, Mr. Speaker, that this nuclear deal is anything but a bad deal when it doesn't meet the benchmarks of the UN Security Council resolutions or even the President's own benchmarks from 2013? Iran was in violation of every one of those resolutions. Yet just 2 days ago, the administration and the rest of the P5+1 went to the UN Security Council to bind ourselves to lifting the resolutions, even though the Iranian regime never complied with a single one. 6 resolutions violated. Each of those resolutions confirmed that Iran was not in compliance with the International Atomic Energy Agency, had not halted enrichment, had not stopped reprocessing, had not halted developing nuclear technology, had not stopped the ballistic missile program. Iran has never met a UN Security Council resolution that it didn't violate. And yet here we are pretending that Iran has somehow complied with the international community and can be trusted this time to live up to its obligation under international law. Let's just take a look at what each of those resolutions required from Iran and what we're no longer requiring Iran to do as a result of this disastrous deal. Mr. Speaker, I will start with UN Security Council Resolution 1696, implemented on July 13, 2006. Demands that Iran suspend all enrichment-related and reprocessing activities, which would be verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency after Iran's noncompliance with the IAEA for over 3 years. It gave Iran 1 month to comply with the IAEA or face the possibility of economic and diplomatic sanctions. It endorsed a diplomatic solution, specifically a P5+1 proposal from 2006 for a long-term comprehensive agreement to determine the exclusively peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program. It called upon states to exercise vigilance to prevent the transfer of any items, materials, goods, and technology that could contribute to Iran's enrichment and reprocessing activities and ballistic missile program. Iran did not comply. UN Security Council Resolution 1737, passed on December 23, 2006. It imposed sanctions on Iran for failing to halt uranium enrichment, as stipulated in United Nations Security Council 1696 that I just spoke about. It reaffirms that Iran shall, without further delay, suspend all enrichment-related and reprocessing activities, including research and development, to be verified by the IAEA, and work on all heavy water-related projects, including the construction of a research reactor moderated by heavy water. The resolution further imposed sanctions on that country, blocking the import or export of sensitive nuclear material and equipment, and freezing the financial assets of persons and entities supporting its proliferation-sensitive nuclear activities or the development of nuclear weapons delivery systems. Also, this resolution established a new committee comprised of all council members to monitor the implementation of the present text and designate further individuals or entities to which the sanctions should apply. I bet Iran was really worried about that new committee. Or how about this resolution, UN Security Council resolution adopted on March 24, 2007. It widened the scope of the previous resolution by banning Iran's arms exports. Arms embargo, prohibit transfers to Iran of nuclear, missile, and dual-use items, exports from Iran of arms or WMD useful technology. It reaffirmed previous positions on Iran's nuclear program, including the suspension of all enrichment activity. It sanctioned additional individual and entities. How many more people can we put on that list? How about another resolution, UN Security Resolution 1803, adopted on March 3, 2008. It approved a new round of sanctions against Iran for refusing to suspend nuclear projects and activities. It reaffirmed all previous resolutions and demanded that Iran cease all enrichment and reprocessing and ballistic missile-related activity. It required countries to inspect suspected cargo to and from Iran, extended the freezing of financial assets to persons or entities supporting Iran's nuclear-related programs or activities. It called upon countries to monitor activities of Iranian banks. It imposed travel restrictions on sanctioned individuals. Or how about UN Security Council Resolution 1835, September 27, 2008, that was adopted. It reaffirmed all previous resolutions. It reports that it found conclusively that Iran is continuing to develop its nuclear program. I bet that was a surprise. It found that Iran was making progress on developing and operating its centrifuges and continued to deliberately block and stonewall. It called on Iran to comply with obligations fully and without delay. Remember, these resolutions are gone now, Mr. Speaker, gone. UN Security Council Resolution 1929, adopted on June 9, 2010. It reaffirmed all previous resolutions. It prohibited Iran from investing abroad in uranium mining, related nuclear technologies, or nuclear-capable ballistic missile technology. It prohibited Iran from launching ballistic missiles, including on its own territory. It required Iran to refrain from any development of ballistic missiles that are nuclear-capable, mandated that countries not export major combat systems to Iran, but does not bar sales of missiles that are not on the UN Registry of Conventional Arms. It called on the vigilance of international lending to Iran, providing trade credits and other financing. It called on countries to inspect cargoes carried by Iran Air Cargo and Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, or by any ship in national or international waters, if there are indications that they are carrying cargo banned for carriage to Iran. Searches in international waters would require concurrence of the country where the ship is registered, but it could happen. It froze the assets of Iranian persons and entities named in annexes to the resolutions and required that countries ban the travel of named Iranians. That was back in the day, Mr. Speaker. Yet here we are today, 2 days after the administration went around Congress to bind the United States to a UN Security Council resolution that will lift all of those resolutions. You see all of those resolutions? We just ripped them up. No longer needed. We did not achieve a single thing that those previous 6 resolutions called for. And now, to make matters worse, Mr. Speaker, the P5+1 countries will honor their obligations on this new UN Security Council resolution while the Iranian regime laughs at us all the way to the bomb. Iran has never felt compelled to honor its international obligations, and now we're just supposed to expect it to comply, to fully comply with this? A zebra can't change its stripes, and this Iranian regime will never feel obligated to abide by this new international agreement. Why tie our hands like this, Mr. Speaker? This is a bad and dangerous nuclear deal. I would urge my colleagues to reject it. There has been a lot of talk, Mr. Speaker, just a few more minutes, about these anytime, anywhere inspections. And I think it's important for us to examine what this agreement actually says about anytime, anywhere. If the IAEA has concerns regarding undeclared nuclear or activities, they can request clarification from Iran. They request clarification from Iran. Oh, please explain to us. And if Iran's clarification does not satisfy the IAEA, then the IAEA can request access to such locations. Request. But if the two sides are unable to reach satisfactory arrangements within 14 days of the IAEA's original request, look at the timeline, Mr. Speaker, then the Joint Commission would advise on how to resolve that issue within an additional 7 days. Then Iran will have another 3 days to implement such a decision. Can you keep up with me, ladies and gentlemen? Which means, do the math. Iran actually has 24 days to stall or hide any undeclared nuclear material. Is that the definition now of any time, anywhere inspections, Mr. Speaker? I don't think so. And Iran's defense minister doesn't think so either. Why do I say that? Just 2 days ago, he said that the IAEA would not be allowed to inspect any of Iran's military sites. They have been saying it over and over again. The Supreme Leader has said the same thing multiple times. Iran will not let foreigners inspect any military center or interview its nuclear scientists. On top of that, Iran's foreign minister and chief negotiator said just yesterday that Iran has secured the so-called right to deny the IAEA access to its nuclear sites for inspections. Iran has also banned American nuclear inspectors from entering any nuclear site or participating in any International Atomic Energy Agency inspection team. No American can participate. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that Iran is caught cheating, as unlikely as that might be. And I'm being facetious, obviously. What happens then? Well, the deal, it says it right here, it's very clear. The deal states that if the countries believe that Iran is not meeting its commitment under this agreement, they can refer the issue to the Joint Commission. The Commission would have 15 days or longer to resolve the issue. Then the issue can be referred to the Ministers of Foreign Affairs. If the Commission could not resolve the issue, that's another 15 days for the ministers, Mr. Speaker. So let's do the math. We're already up to 30 days at the minimum. Then the compliant participant could request that the issue be considered to the advisory boards, which will have another 15 days to issue a non-binding opinion. If it is not resolved during this process, then the UN Security Council gets notified. By the end, another 2 months or so would have passed and given Iran enough time to lobby Russia, China, and the rest of the P5+1 to vote with them so that sanctions are not reimposed. And remember, Mr. Speaker, sanctions will only be reimposed in the event of a significant non-performance by Iran. The key word there is significant. What does the U.S. consider significant violations? What do the Europeans consider significant violations? What does China consider? What does Russia, Iran itself consider significant violations? So Iran can prevent from sanctions being reimposed as long as they cheat only in small increments and not significantly. If they just cheat a little bit, they can get away with it. Additionally, the JCPOA explicitly states, quote, Iran has stated that if sanctions are reinstated in whole or in part, Iran will treat that as grounds to cease performing its commitment under this JCPOA in whole or in part. So Iran is saying, if you put sanctions on us, we don't have to continue with this agreement. I'm not making it up. That's a quote. Even if Iran is caught cheating and we move to reimpose sanctions, as we are entitled to do under the JCPOA, Iran is actually entitled to walk away from the deal. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I feel that Iran will use this as its trump card to bully the P5+1 into not addressing violations or holding Iran accountable for its cheating. And even though the United States has the ability to veto a Security Council vote, choosing not to reimpose sanctions and hold Iran accountable, we must again remember that such a veto would unravel this deal, reapply sanctions, and allow Iran to claim it can walk away. Finally, an effective sanctions regime against Iran was established over many years, cannot be easily reapplied. The idea of snapback sanctions is simply not viable. And, Mr. Speaker, I could go on and on about all of the loopholes in this deal. So we can do better than this. We must do better than this. We owe it to our children and our grandchildren to do better than this. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentlewoman yields back.